Look at him. He can't even dress himself anymore. You know that moment when your whole world stops? Would you have stopped her right there at your wife's funeral, or would you have stayed silent to keep the peace? My daughter's voice exploded across the funeral home. I'd been standing there quietly, holding Linda Hayes's prayer book, the same one she'd carried to church every Sunday for 20 years, when Amy decided to announce to 50 mourners that I was falling apart. And the hell of it was, she wasn't entirely wrong. 3 days earlier, I used to be the guy who handled things. I'd arranged my father's funeral, managed Linda's mother's estate. I knew how to tie a tie, how to greet mourners, how to be strong when people needed me to be strong. But that morning, I'd stood in our dark bedroom, unable to turn on the light because it meant seeing Linda's empty pillow. I'd fumbled through my dresser, grabbing whatever I could find. When I'd accidentally opened her jewelry box looking for cufflinks, the scent of her perfume had nearly brought me to my knees. One brown shoe, one black shoe, my tie hanging crooked, my shirt wrinkled from sleeping in it. But standing there, with every head turned toward me, Mrs. Davis from the grocery store, Tom Wilson from the hardware store, people who'd known me for 20 years, I realized Amy wasn't just pointing out my appearance, she was dismantling me in public. "Amy, please," I whispered. "Not here." "Not here? Dad, when else am I supposed to deal with this?" She gestured toward me like I was a problem she needed to solve. "Look at yourself. Mom's been gone 3 days and you're already completely helpless." Helpless. The word hit the room like a slap, and I watched these people, my neighbors, my friends, process what they were seeing. Was this grief, or was this proof that I really couldn't function without Linda? I wanted to tell them I'd been alone in our house for exactly 72 hours, and it felt like drowning, that I'd put on mismatched shoes because opening Linda's closet to find my good ones had sent me to my knees sobbing, that forgetting to shower wasn't senility. It was the fact that everything in our bathroom still smelled like her perfume. But how do you explain that when your own daughter is telling a room full of people that you're incompetent? "Everyone can see you need help," Amy continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the funeral home. "You can't take care of yourself. You haven't showered. You can't dress yourself. What happens when all these people leave? What happens when you're alone?" And that's when I felt it. The shift. The moment when this stopped being a daughter worried about her father and became something else. Amy wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking at the room, making sure everyone heard. This wasn't worry. This was control. These weren't questions asked quietly, with love. This was a performance. And I was the spectacle. "I'll be okay," managed to say, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "No, you won't be okay. That's the problem." Amy stepped closer, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You've never lived alone a day in your life. Mom did everything for you for 48 years, everything. And now you expect to just figure it out?" She was right about that too. Linda had handled our social calendar, our bills, our medical appointments. She'd remembered birthdays, managed our investments, even picked out most of my clothes. I'd built a successful business, but Linda had built our life. "Ma'am," the funeral director said quietly, approaching us, "perhaps we could—" "Don't ask him to make any decisions today," Amy cut him off, louder than necessary. "I'm his daughter. From now on, any paperwork, any arrangements, anything that needs signing, you come through me. He's not capable of handling this." Not capable, said in front of 50 people who'd watched me run a successful plumbing business for 30 years. The room went silent, except for someone crying softly in the back. Mrs. Davis wouldn't look at me anymore. Tom Wilson was studying his shoes. I stood there, surrounded by faces I'd known for decades, watching them decide whether Amy was right, whether I really had become the helpless old man she was describing. The worst part wasn't the humiliation. It was the voice in my head whispering that maybe she had a point. Maybe I really was falling apart. Maybe Linda's death had revealed what I'd always been underneath. Someone who couldn't function without being managed. Amy thought this public diagnosis was necessary. She had no idea what Linda had written in her will to protect me from exactly this moment. In the quiet afterward, watching my neighbors file past Linda's casket with careful, pitying glances in my direction, I felt something break. Not just grief, though that was crushing me, but something deeper. The sense that I was disappearing along with my wife, becoming smaller and more helpless with each of Amy's words. I didn't know it then, but Linda had seen this coming. She'd watched Amy's need to control, to manage, to fix everything whether it needed fixing or not. "Amy means well," she'd whispered to me once during her illness, "but don't let her mean well you to death." And she'd left me a weapon I didn't even know I had. I just had to survive long enough to find it. The morning after the funeral, Amy showed up at my house with a stack of papers and a look of concern that might have been genuine. Part of me hoped it was. "We need to talk about your situation, Dad," she said, settling herself at my kitchen table like she belonged there. "I've been thinking about this all night, and I'm worried about you." I poured myself coffee with hands that still shook. Everything felt different without Linda. The house was too quiet, too empty, too full of memories. Maybe Amy was right to be worried. "This place is way too big for one person," Amy said, looking around. Her disapproval seemed real enough, but was it concern or something else? Especially someone who clearly can't maintain it properly. She wasn't wrong about the maintenance. Dishes were piled in the sink. Mail was scattered across the counter. Linda's coffee cup still sat by the window where she'd left it 3 mornings ago. I couldn't bring myself to move it. "I can clean up," I said, though even as I said it, the task felt overwhelming. "Dad, when's the last time you showered? When's the last time you changed clothes?" Amy pulled out her phone and started making notes with the efficiency of someone who'd thought this through. "You're falling apart, and this house is falling apart with you." I touched my unshaven face. She was right. I'd been wearing the same shirt for 2 days. When had basic self-care become so impossible? "I've already called Sunset Gardens," Amy continued, her voice taking on a businesslike tone. "It's an assisted living facility about 20 minutes from here. They have availability and they can take you as early as next week." Assisted living? "Amy, I don't need—" "Don't you?" She leaned forward, and for a moment I saw something that might have been genuine worry in her eyes. "You need meals prepared for you. You need someone to remind you to take your medications. You need supervision, Dad. Yesterday at the funeral proved that." Maybe she was right. Maybe what had happened at the funeral really was proof that I'd lost the ability to function. But something about her tone, businesslike, efficient, made me wonder if this was really about my welfare or something else entirely. She spread some brochures across my table. Happy old people playing cards, doing crafts, eating in a communal dining room. It looked like a very nice prison. "What about the house?" "The house will be sold. The market's good right now. I've already talked to a realtor and she thinks we can get $450, maybe $500,000. After we pay off what's left of the mortgage and cover your care costs, there should be plenty left over." Left over for what, I wondered. For her. I don't want to sell Linda's house. "Dad, it's not Linda's house anymore. Linda's gone. And you can't live here alone. What if you fall? What if you forget to turn off the stove? What if you have a medical emergency?" Amy pulled a manila folder from her bag with the efficiency of someone who'd planned this conversation. The papers were already printed, already organized with yellow tabs marking where to sign. "I've already spoken to the bank about the transfer process," she added, like it was nothing. "Power of attorney, medical directive, financial authorization. Just temporary until we get you situated." I stared at the documents that would give my daughter complete control over my life, my money, my property, my medical decisions, everything. This felt wrong. This felt like something more permanent than temporary. "This is what Mom would want," Amy said, and those words hit harder than anything else. "She worried about you constantly. She knew you'd need help if something happened to her." Linda had worried about me. I'd seen it in her eyes during those final weeks in the hospital. The way she'd ask if I was eating, if I was taking my blood pressure medication, if I remembered to pay the electric bill. Had she seen something in me that I was only now recognizing? But Linda had also loved my independence. She'd been proud when I built the business, when I solved problems, when I figured things out on my own. Would she really want me to sign all of that away after 3 days of grief? "She made me promise to take care of you," Amy added, but there was something in her voice now, impatience creeping through the concern. "So that's what I'm doing." I stared at the papers for a long moment. Once I signed these, there would be no going back. Amy would have control, and people who've been given that kind of power don't usually volunteer to give it up. "I need time to think about this," I said. "Dad, there's no time. The realtor wants to list the house this week. Sunset Gardens won't hold the spot much longer. And frankly, after yesterday," she gestured toward me, "you need help now, not later." My hands were shaking as I picked up the pen. Once I signed these, Amy could sell the house, control my bank accounts, make my medical decisions. I should have asked for time to consult a lawyer, but how do you tell your daughter you don't trust her? "Where do I sign?" I asked quietly, knowing that this moment might be the last time I'd ever make a decision for myself. Amy smiled for the first time since Linda's diagnosis. "Right here, Dad. Don't worry about anything. I'll handle everything from now on. I'll make all the decisions." As I signed page after page, I told myself this was temporary, just until I got back on my feet. But with each signature, I felt doors closing behind me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was signing away more than just paperwork. I was signing away myself. Within 2 weeks, Amy had orchestrated everything with military precision. The realtor, the intake coordinator, the boxes, all arriving in sequence like a well-rehearsed play. The house sold in 10 days. Cash buyer, no questions asked, $520,000 for the home Linda and I had shared for 30 years. Combined with my business savings, nearly $800,000 under Amy's control. After commission and closing costs, that's $480 for your care fund, Amy announced, like she was discussing stock portfolios instead of selling my life. I watched her pack away 48 years of accumulated life into containers marked donation or storage. You won't need most of this at Sunset Gardens, she said, wrapping Linda's china like evidence to be destroyed. My father's Purple Heart, our wedding photos, the tools from my plumbing business, everything that proved I'd once been someone who mattered. Focus on essentials, Amy said when I hesitated. You're transitioning to professional care. By Friday, I stood in a sterile room with a single bed, one chair by the window, and Linda's photo on a small dresser. Through the glass, a parking lot, a chain-link fence, the world I'd been removed from for my own good. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about care anymore. It was about control. Life at Sunset Gardens followed a schedule designed to eliminate choice. Breakfast, medications, activities, repeat. Amy visited twice weekly with updates about my care fund, always speaking like I was much older than 67. The investments are doing well, she'd say. You don't need to worry about details. Can I see the statements? Dad, you signed power of attorney. I handle all that now. But something bothered me about her tone. The way she said, your money, sounded like someone humoring a child. I started watching the other residents. George, supposedly too confused for finances, had been an accountant for 40 years. Helen, here for safety concerns, had taught high school English. They didn't seem incompetent. They seemed like people convinced they were incompetent by family members who found it convenient. I asked to see my paperwork. Denied. I asked to call my accountant. Supervised calls only. I asked about visiting my neighborhood. Transportation required Amy's approval. This wasn't assisted living. This was prison. If I was really incompetent, how was I analyzing this so clearly? Maybe I wasn't as helpless as I'd been led to believe. 4 months later, a lawyer called. Mr. Hayes. Karen Walsh from Walsh, Burke & Associates. I'm calling about your wife's will. There's been a request for a formal reading. All beneficiaries must be present this Friday at 2. I thought Amy handled all that. I've already spoken with Amy. She's arranged transportation. Friday afternoon, a black sedan took me downtown to a glass office building I remembered from my business days. Karen Walsh led me to a conference room where Amy waited, looking impatient, alongside a man in an expensive suit. Dad, I don't understand why we need this formal procedure, Amy said. Karen opened a thick file. Actually, there are aspects of your mother's will that haven't been discussed. Provisions that only activate under certain circumstances. What provisions? Amy's voice had an edge. Linda's will includes codicils added during her final illness. If Robert Hayes is manipulated into supervised care, the estate shall be distributed as follows. 60% to the Alzheimer's Association, 20% to Legal Aid's Elder Abuse Prevention Program, 20% to establish a fund for improperly institutionalized elderly. Amy shot to her feet. That's impossible. She also left a letter. Karen unfolded Linda's stationery. My dearest Robert, if you're hearing this, you've been placed in supervised care, probably by Amy. I love our daughter, but I know her weaknesses. She's always seen you as helpless and been drawn to control. You are not helpless. You built a successful business, raised 2 children, maintained our household for 48 years. The only thing you cannot do is live without me. Not because you're incompetent, but because I never let you. Fight for yourself, Robert. Fight for your right to make mistakes, to be confused sometimes, to live independently even if it's not perfect. Fight for your right to be treated like the competent adult you are. If you stay in supervised care, Amy gets nothing. But if you choose to reclaim your independence, everything comes to you. I love you, Robert. I always believed in your strength. Amy was crying. This is cruel. Linda is turning you against me for trying to take care of Dad. No, I said, my voice stronger than it had been in months. She's calling you out for treating me like I was incompetent. How much of my money have you spent, Amy? The man in the expensive suit spoke. Detective Morrison, Financial Crimes Unit. According to bank records, approximately $650,000 has been transferred from Robert Hayes's accounts to accounts controlled by Amy Hayes over 4 months. Sunset Gardens costs $3,800 monthly. 4 months would cost $15,000. Where did the other $635,000 go? The silence became an answer. I want to leave that place, I said. Today. Dad, you can't, Amy said frantically. You don't have anywhere to go. Then I'll figure it out. What I won't do is stay in prison while you steal everything Linda and I worked for. Karen Walsh smiled. Mr. Hayes, I think your wife would be very proud. 6 months later, I stood in my new apartment kitchen making morning coffee, something I'd done thousands of times before, but never quite like this. My coffee, my kitchen timer, my choice of how strong to make it. On the counter sat Linda's prayer book, the one I'd held that awful day at her funeral. Now it felt like a reminder of survival instead of loss. The first grocery trip had been terrifying, standing in the cereal aisle, overwhelmed by choices I'd never had to make, but I'd figured it out, one decision at a time. Amy had been arrested for elder financial abuse. Most of my money was recovered. She faced 2 years in prison. I'd hired a weekly cleaning service. I'd joined a community center. I'd started seeing a widow named Patricia who thought my story was inspiring. Choice was what made the difference between living and existing. Amy had written from prison. A long apology trying to explain how she'd convinced herself that controlling my life was caring for me. I'd written back briefly, saying I hoped she'd learn the difference between love and management. Every morning when I woke in my own bed, making my own decisions, I thought about Linda's letter, about her insistence that I was worth fighting for. Amy had called me helpless in front of everyone at Linda's funeral. Linda had used her will to call me strong. I knew which voice I was going to listen to,